Today's story is one of those that reminds you that the truth really is stranger than fiction sometimes. Seriously, this case, and more specifically the plan of the person responsible, feels like it could have been lifted from the script of a crime thriller show like CSI. But unfortunately, what happened here is all too real. And quite frankly, as we'll see, things get far darker and more unhinged than anything you're likely to see on TV. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. In the early evening of June 10th, 2019, officers from New Jersey's Plainsboro Police Department arrived at a local apartment complex. A little while before this, they had received calls asking them to do a welfare check on a resident there. Some people were concerned and had said that they were having trouble reaching the person that lived in one of the second-floor units. At this point, all of this was still very routine. This person had actually been seen earlier that same day, and as far as anyone knew, there was no specific cause for alarm. But police were there to just kind of check things out and make sure everything was okay. When they got to the apartment in question, everything looked completely normal from the outside. The front door was closed and locked, and there were no signs of trouble. However, that turned out to be incredibly misleading. You see, waiting just on the other side of that door was something absolutely devastating. And the only thing more chilling than what authorities were about to walk into was the horribly twisted explanation behind it. Several hours before all of this, so that morning, a woman named Carolyn Byington arrived at work. That day had started out like any other Monday. Carolyn had driven to her office, which was sort of your typical shared corporate building located on the outskirts of the town of Princeton. Carolyn worked at a marketing agency called Engine Group and was a market research project manager. It was a good job, and she had already been promoted a couple of times since starting there in 2016. In fact, things in general were going really well for Carolyn. At just 26 years old, she had already accomplished quite a bit in life. She was a college graduate, she'd traveled and spent time in multiple places across the world, and now she had settled into this promising career where there were a lot of opportunities for growth. None of this was an accident. Carolyn was an extremely hard-working and motivated young woman, and she'd been that way from the time that she was little. According to family members, she was always very organized and enjoyed challenging herself. Every year, she'd set new goals and then would meticulously work to achieve them. Carolyn was born and raised in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, a community in Bernards Township, about 20 miles west of Newark. From the sounds of it, she had a happy and relatively normal childhood. I say relatively normal because Carolyn was actually born with kind of a scary medical condition. The condition is called Chiari malformation, and it's a structural defect where part of your brain tissue extends into the spinal canal. Essentially, the cerebellum, which is located right back here, pushes out through the opening at the base of your skull. Chiari malformation can cause a number of problems and symptoms that really range in severity. Some people apparently go their whole lives without knowing about the defect, while others can have everything from neck pain and terrible chronic headaches to numbness, balance issues, spinal problems, and even trouble breathing and swallowing. It's not clear to what extent Carolyn suffered from the condition, but what we do know is that in 2008, when she was in her mid-teens, she was treated by an acclaimed neurosurgeon named Dr. Mark Suidan. The treatment was completely successful, and it sounds like the experience really had a big impact on Carolyn. Not just because it was a huge relief to not have this condition quite literally weighing on her anymore, but because it inspired her to try to find ways to make her own positive impact in the world, which she definitely did. Carolyn had gone on to work with several charitable organizations. While attending Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, she was an event coordinator for the American Cancer Society. Later, she had joined the Junior League of Greater Princeton, an organization comprised of women looking to make a difference in their communities through leadership and volunteer work. I mentioned before that Carolyn had spent time overseas, and that was because one of her other great passions in life was traveling. One of her favorite things to do was plan family vacations because she was extremely close with her parents and her older sister, Caitlin. But during her time in college, she'd also taken the opportunity to study abroad. This had allowed her to spend time in places like Germany and Japan while working on her degrees in international affairs, anthropology, and sociology. So yeah, all of this is to say that Carolyn had done everything right, and she was well on her way to what should have been a bright and successful future. But sadly, that's not what would happen. You see, while June 10th, 2019 might have been just an average Monday from Carolyn's perspective, there was something going on around her that she didn't know about. Something incredibly disturbing. And because she had no idea what this was, that day she would unknowingly make a fateful decision. Later that afternoon, so around 3 or 4 p.m., some of Carolyn's coworkers at Engine Group noticed that they hadn't seen her in a little while. Things were busy at the office because, everyone was getting back into the swing of things from the weekend. But they knew that she had been there that morning. That day, Carolyn had gone home on her lunch break, which wasn't something she normally did. However, she had a couple of things to take care of, and her apartment was only about a 6-mile drive away. She left around 1 p.m., figuring she had more than enough time. Except now, she had been missing from her desk for a couple of hours. When her colleagues realized this, initially they were kind of annoyed. Another one of their coworkers was already late getting back from lunch that afternoon, and it had delayed a meeting they were supposed to have. It's one of those things that you'll probably understand if you've ever worked in an office before. If one person is late or does something you're not supposed to, that's whatever, maybe they get a warning. But as soon as a second person does the same thing, that's when you know there's going to be like a company-wide email going out about a new rule or policy about that thing. So it wasn't that other employees were mad at Carolyn or anything. It's more like they were preemptively rolling their eyes, like, oh God, now they're going to be cracking down on lunch breaks. But as it got later and later into the afternoon, that sort of mild annoyance steadily turned more and more into concern. It already wasn't like Carolyn to just take an extended lunch break without notifying anyone. But she also wasn't responding to any calls or messages. By the time the end of the day rolled around and still no one had heard anything, a couple of Carolyn's coworkers decided to call the police and ask them to conduct a welfare check on her at her home. Carolyn lived alone in a large luxury rental community called the Hunter's Glen Apartments. The buildings there were organized into rows of little fourplex-style suites separated by stairwells for the upper levels, and Carolyn lived in one of these second-floor units. That call for the welfare check came in just a few minutes before 6 p.m. that evening, and officers from the Plainsboro Police Department got there a short time later. When they did, they went up to Carolyn's apartment. As I mentioned earlier, at first, everything seemed normal. That was, until the officers actually went inside. Not far beyond the doorway, police found Carolyn lying on the ground. She was covered in blood, was completely unresponsive, and it was clear she had been the victim of a vicious attack. Sadly, there was nothing anyone could do. Shortly after paramedics arrived, she was pronounced dead. It was later determined during an autopsy that Carolyn had died from a combination of puncture wounds to her neck and blunt force injuries to her head. The killing had been incredibly brutal. Not only had she been beaten and stabbed, but the injuries she had suffered were strange. These weren't your typical knife wounds. The puncture marks were irregular and suggested that multiple weapons had been used. It was as if the killer had grabbed whatever they could find and attacked her with it. This wasn't the only unusual detail uncovered. Back at Carolyn's apartment, investigators couldn't find any indication that anything had been stolen there. As previously mentioned, there were also no signs of forced entry at the residence. All of these facts led detectives to theorize that whoever had done this was likely very familiar with Carolyn and her apartment. As a result, they concluded that the motive was likely personal. They still had no idea what that motive could be, but they believed the culprit was probably someone close to her. Because there was also DNA evidence found at the crime scene, police were confident that the murder would be solved within a couple of days. However, they quickly ran into a problem. You see, when they started looking into all of the usual suspects, so to speak, they hit a dead end. There were a couple of early people that they interviewed that they considered persons of interest, but they were soon ruled out. Investigators got more bad news when they learned that despite all of the great amenities and high-end facilities at Carolyn's apartment complex, one of the things they didn't have a lot of were surveillance cameras. So they didn't have much to work with that would help them identify her killer. Carolyn's neighbors were able to offer a little bit of information. They said that Carolyn was normally very quiet and kept to herself. The only time they ever really saw her was when she was coming and going from work. On the afternoon of June 10th, though, Carolyn's downstairs neighbor said that they had heard what they now realized were faint screams. They estimated that this had happened sometime between 1 and 2 p.m., and that immediately afterwards this was followed by the sounds of moving furniture. This was useful because it narrowed the timeline of the murder significantly. It meant that Carolyn had likely been attacked almost immediately after she arrived home for lunch. Of course, this still didn't point police in the direction of a specific suspect. Fortunately, though, that was about to change. About a week after Carolyn's murder, while Plainsboro police were still hard at work collecting and chasing down any leads they could find, they got a call from a representative at Carolyn's company. The person basically said, "Hey, there's something we think you should know about. One of our employees here has been acting very weird for the past few days. We're not sure what's going on, but you might want to come and check it out." The employee in question was a man named Kenneth Saal. Kenneth was a staff accountant at the marketing agency, and he'd started working there around the same time as Carolyn. By all accounts, Kenneth was a nice enough guy. He was 30 years old, he lived about an hour away in the borough of Lindenwold, and he was married to his high school sweetheart. He was also a new father. He and his wife had celebrated the birth of their first child, a baby girl, just 9 months earlier. According to coworkers, though, Kenneth's behavior had taken a real turn following Carolyn's death. Now, obviously, everyone in the office had been affected by what had happened on some level. I mean, it was devastating. But unlike everyone else, Kenneth didn't seem to be upset. He seemed nervous. Employees told police that Kenneth had been super jittery since the news about the murder came out. In fact, out of nowhere during a conversation, he had asked a colleague whether you could be arrested for a crime solely based on circumstantial evidence. Coworkers had also noticed that in the days immediately after Carolyn was killed, Kenneth had strange cuts on his hands and knuckles that hadn't been there before. There was one more thing, and this was a big one. I mentioned before that on the day of the crime, there was another person who was late returning from lunch. Well, that person was Kenneth Saal. As it turned out, he had taken his lunch break at almost the exact same time Carolyn had. Actually, he had left the office just a few minutes before her. Needless to say, the timing of this now seemed pretty important, especially considering Kenneth's other strange behavior. What was also interesting was that when Kenneth returned from lunch on June 10th, he was wearing a different shirt than when he left. After learning all of this, detectives sat down for an interview with Kenneth on June 19th. During that conversation, they asked him about everything they had been told by his coworkers. Kenneth admitted that he had previously worked with Carolyn on projects at the company, but claimed that on June 10th he'd only seen her in passing at the office. He confirmed that he had taken his lunch around 1 p.m. that day, but said that he hadn't been anywhere near Carolyn's apartment. Instead, he stated that he needed the extended break to work on his car. He said that his Honda Accord was having problems, so he had driven it to a park right by the office so that he could try and fix it. This detail about the car caught the attention of detectives because it was different than the story that they had heard from Kenneth's coworkers. Kenneth's supervisor had shown them texts he had sent her saying that he was taking his car to a local mechanic, and that's why he was going to be late coming back from lunch. When questioned about this discrepancy, Kenneth claimed that he was telling detectives the truth, but that he had lied to his supervisor. He explained that he was too embarrassed to admit that he was working on his car himself. He also said that this is why he had changed his shirt before returning to the office. Investigators didn't really buy Kenneth's story, nor did it explain the sudden change in his behavior that his colleagues had noticed. But they didn't have any hard evidence against him. They let him go, but before they did, they asked him to voluntarily provide a DNA sample, which he agreed to. Unfortunately, over the next few weeks, very little additional progress was made. The DNA collected from Kenneth Saal, as well as several other people, was sent off for testing, but the process was slow-moving. In the meantime, Plainsboro police continued working whatever angles of the case that they could think of. It's a good thing they did, because they were about to find something huge. In fact, a bunch of different things were about to fall into place all at once. The thing that kicked everything off was a random bit of dashcam video that investigators discovered had been recorded on the afternoon of the murder. This was actually footage from a police patrol car, and it showed a vehicle matching the exact make and model of Kenneth Saal's car driving through an area of Plainsboro. Not only was this spot right near Carolyn's apartment complex, the video had been recorded just after 2 p.m. that day. In other words, right during the time frame of the crime. This was enough to allow authorities to obtain search warrants for Kenneth's vehicle and cell phone. The phone, in particular, further blew up his alibi. Data from the device proved that it was definitely him in the dashcam footage. If this weren't damning enough, the results of the DNA analysis came back the same day those search warrants were issued. The tests showed that Kenneth's DNA matched a sample that was found at the crime scene. The sample was from underneath Carolyn Byington's fingernails. On August 21st, so about 2.5 months after the murder, Kenneth was arrested at his home. He was charged with first-degree murder as well as a third-degree weapons violation. Of course, as clear-cut as the evidence was, there were still some pretty massive questions on everyone's minds. Why had Kenneth done this? What was he doing at Carolyn's apartment on the day he had killed her? And moreover, how had he managed to get in and out of her place without any signs of forced entry? Well, investigators would find out the answers to these questions, but not right away. You see, despite the strong case against him, Kenneth Saal wasn't willing to go down without a fight. He refused a 30-year plea deal in the case when it was offered to him by prosecutors. I want to be clear, this wasn't because he was innocent, though. It's because while behind bars, he came up with a second completely unhinged plot that he believed would fool authorities and get him his freedom. You know that old phrase, you gotta spend money to make money? Well, that was kind of Kenneth's approach here, only with killing. Essentially, his thinking was, you gotta commit murder to get away with murder. So, during the roughly 3 years that Kenneth was in jail awaiting trial, he began scheming with one of his cellmates. Basically, he knew that this guy was going to be released soon, and his idea was that if he could get him to commit a copycat murder that was similar enough to Carolyn's, then prosecutors would have to let him go. They would think that this was actually the work of a serial killer who had yet to be identified and that they had charged the wrong person. If that already sounds crazy, it gets even worse. In order to make the whole thing seem more convincing, Kenneth wanted his cellmate to try and frame one of the other suspects in the case. I mentioned before that there were a couple of other early persons of interest who were ruled out. Well, Kenneth suggested that they kill one of these people too and leave behind a note confessing to Carolyn's murder. From the sounds of it, there were actually several variations of this plan that Kenneth came up with, and he seemingly wasn't too picky in terms of who got murdered. For the people that they could frame, he floated a few different names, and at one point he even toyed with the idea of having one of the investigators or witnesses who were supposed to testify killed. He figured at the very least this would probably delay his trial. The one thing Kenneth was very insistent about, though, is how the killing of the second female victim had to go. He explained that in order to match Carolyn's murder as closely as possible, the victim should be a white female in her late 20s or early 30s. He stated that a screwdriver, scissors, and a pen should be used as the weapons. And most disturbing of all, the killer needed to make sure that the victim's neck was severely damaged. Kenneth went on to give his cellmate tips about how to clean up the crime scene with bleach to avoid leaving behind physical evidence, and reminded him to disable the location finder on his cell phone. He also offered him $15,000 if he could successfully pull off the plan. Unfortunately for Kenneth, though, the reason we know all of this is because his cellmate was not on board with his horrifying plot. He cooperated with investigators and wore a recording device during conversations with Kenneth, giving them all of this additional insight and evidence. If there was any doubt that Kenneth was serious about his deranged plan, when a search of his cell was ordered in the fall of 2022, that went away. Guards found the fake confession notes he had written and was planning to use to frame those other innocent would-be victims. By the way, all of this happened just weeks before Kenneth was scheduled to begin his trial. It was only after this, when Kenneth was slapped with a mountain of other charges, that he finally accepted that he had been caught. And as part of a new plea deal that would see him serve substantially more prison time, he agreed to fill in the missing pieces of Carolyn's murder. In an absolutely chilling confession, Kenneth revealed that he had been obsessed with Carolyn for quite a while before the killing. He didn't describe it that way. In his words, he was intrigued by her, which somehow is even creepier if you ask me. But hold on, because things get way more unsettling. Kenneth admitted that approximately 2 months before the killing, he had managed to secretly steal the key to Carolyn's apartment while they were both at work. Immediately after this, he had taken the key, had it copied, and returned the original before she ever noticed. For the next several weeks, Kenneth had been using his lunch breaks to go to Carolyn's apartment while she was at the office. During that time, he had set up several hidden cameras there, which he had used to secretly spy on her without her knowledge. The whole setup was apparently disturbingly sophisticated. Kenneth had an app on his phone which allowed him to not only monitor the cameras, but adjust and align them remotely. Now, Kenneth could have just stopped here. Don't get me wrong, it still would have been a disgusting and unforgivable invasion of privacy. But you can see how this never needed to result in someone being viciously murdered. And it turned out that was true all the way up until the very end. You see, on June 10th, Kenneth had gone to Carolyn's apartment to install another one of his perverted spy cameras. Only what he didn't know was that Carolyn was planning to go home for lunch that day. Kenneth only heard Carolyn right as she was opening up her front door and ran to hide behind it. But instead of pushing her aside and running away or doing any number of things that would have caused this situation to turn out differently, he grabbed some of the tools he had brought with him, as well as whatever other items were in his immediate vicinity, and he brutally stabbed and beat Carolyn to death. Following the murder, Kenneth had texted his supervisor that lie about him taking his car into the mechanic. Then he had hastily tried to clean up the scene. He closed and locked Carolyn's apartment door to further cover up the crime, changed his shirt, and then returned to the office as if nothing had happened. Sure enough, when residents at the Hunters Glen apartments were shown pictures of Kenneth Saal, several of them said that they recognized him. While no one had specifically connected him to the situation with Carolyn, the witnesses said that they had seen a man matching his description skulking around the complex's laundry facilities in the weeks leading up to the crime. Shortly after Kenneth's confession and his whole deranged copycat killer plot being exposed, he pleaded guilty to a number of charges, including murder, burglary, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. At his sentencing hearing, Kenneth expressed remorse for his actions, apologizing to Carolyn and her loved ones, as well as everyone in his own life. Honestly, there are moments of this that I would argue are genuinely heartbreaking, particularly when he talks about his wife and, of course, his young daughter, who would now be growing up without a father.
If there was any way I could take back things that I had done, I would, without question. I regret immensely the pain I have caused you all. There are no words big enough to describe the atrociousness of what I've done or the misery I've brought on you. It's my parents and sister. I'm sorry for the embarrassment that I have caused you. I'm sorry for the way I am, and that I've hidden it from you for so long, for my entire life. The facade I put up kept you from seeing any warning signs. To my ex-wife, I'm sorry that I failed you as a husband. I broke our family apart with my terrible decisions when we had just been starting out. I threw away everything we worked to build over the decade we were together. To my daughter, I'm sorry that I've made such poor decisions in my life that will keep me from watching you grow up. I wanted to be there for you for all of your firsts. I've missed so many already, and will miss so much more. I have no one to blame but myself.
Now, while acknowledging that this is very sad, it's important to focus on the actual victim here, or should I say victims, because as much as Kenneth's actions undoubtedly harmed the lives of the people around him, he did infinitely more damage to Carolyn Byington and her loved ones. In their own gut-wrenching remarks at the sentencing hearing, Carolyn's family members described the permanent absence that had been left in their lives because of the crime. Her sister Caitlin spoke about how Carolyn was supposed to be the maid of honor at her upcoming wedding and the godmother to her future children. Her father Robert talked about Carolyn's strong belief in helping others, her knack for organization, and her love of all kinds of different music. The most crushing words by far, though, were delivered by Carolyn's mother, Jennifer. She described how at a family birthday gathering shortly before her murder, Carolyn had wanted more hugs. She told the court, quote, "But no more hugs are coming. I try to accept her death every day." It seems like even the judge was deeply affected by the case. During closing remarks, he urged Carolyn's loved ones to celebrate her memory by living the way that she would have wanted them to. He said in part, quote, "Move on from today. She made each one of your lives better because she was in it. Mourn her by celebrating who she was and everything she gave. She wants you to live your life." Well, it seems that Carolyn's family members did exactly that, because when this was all over, they set up a donation page in her name with the Children's Brain Tumor Project. The donations were arranged so that they would help to support the research of the doctor who I told you about that had treated her Chiari malformation. The page reads in part, quote, "We want the last chapter of Carolyn's life to be one where her friends and loved ones can help others in her memory. Carolyn was a true philanthropist who was active in many charitable organizations, and we know she would have wanted to help other children under Dr. Suidan's care by supporting his research." When all of the court proceedings finished, Kenneth Saal was sentenced to 55 years in prison. According to the latest available information we could find, he is currently incarcerated at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. His earliest eligible parole date is listed as May 20th, 2066.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.